Thank you very much, Your Honor. Honorable Senators, I want to acknowledge that I come from Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation, and that the Parliament of Canada is located on the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin-Anishinaabe territory. I thank Senator McCallum for bringing this bill to the Senate of Canada to honor the life and legacy of Thanadelthur, a young Indigenous woman of strength, resilience, and fierce determination to protect her people. She was a teenager and an effective ambassador of peace in the early 1700s. Records from the time speak of her as a skilled guide, peacemaker, interpreter, and negotiator who played a crucial role in the expansion of the fur trade in the early 1700s. More importantly, at a time when Dene and Cree were traditional enemies, Thanadelthur was the indispensable key to forging peace between the two nations. Her remarkable story allows us to reflect both on the extraordinary impact she had in shaping our shared history as a nation and, lamentably, on the many ways in which Indigenous stories, cultural practices, and contributions have been ignored for far too long. By supporting sending this bill to committee, we are sending a strong message and affirming our commitment that these Indigenous stories must not continue to be forgotten. Thanadelthur was a peace builder before Canada became a nation, before Manitoba existed. Thanadelthur was a member of the Dene Nation, indigenous to the subarctic region of what is now known as Nunavut and northern Manitoba. In 1713, while on a caribou hunting expedition with her family, she was captured by Cree warriors. She managed to escape after a year of activity, and after a harrowing journey, she came back to her family very near death. She, at that time, lived in York Factory, an early Hudson's Bay Company trading post. Thanadelthur's great work came about just a few years later, in 1715, when she was employed as the guide, interpreter, and negotiator for the Hudson's Bay Company in their efforts to establish peaceful relations between the Cree and the Dene. Her Dene, Cree, and English trilingualism, her tenacity and perseverance, and her skill as a negotiator led to a historic peace agreement between the two traditionally warring peoples. I mark the wisdom, humility, and the depth of character this young woman in choosing to forego feelings of revenge or hostility towards those who were her traditional enemies and her captors, and instead chose to forge a path to peace. The Hudson Bay records from that period make it clear that peace would have been unattainable without her pivotal role. In June 1715, a delegation of 150 people set out on a peace mission and traveled some 1,000 kilometers in 8 months, pushing through an Arctic winter. It was Thanadelthur's guidance and determination that kept the delegates from turning back. It was her skill and knowledge that kept them from perishing in the wild, and ultimately, it was her fortitude that saw the final peace accord implemented. To quote from a record of that period, quote, "She made them all stand in fear of her as she scolded at some and forced them to be at peace." Please remember, this is a teenager taking this role. Her voice was said to be hoarse from persuading her people. Sadly, she succumbed to illness less than 2 years later and died on February 5th, 1717, buried in York Fort. Hers is a story that still resonates within Cree and Dene communities in their oral history to this day. Examining her story from a distance of over 300 years, we can learn modern lessons. Thanadelthur is but an early example of the tireless leadership and resolute quality of Indigenous women who both nurture as mothers and protect as warriors. I think of contemporary Thanadelthurs who, despite obstacles, hardship, and opposition, are similarly leading restorative peace and reconciliation efforts in our own time, such as Indigenous activists like the late Mary Early, Cindy Blackstock, Pam Pomander, Leslie Spillett, Autumn Peltier, Diane Redsky, our former senator colleagues, the Honourable Sandra Lovelace Nicholas and the Honourable Lillian Dick. In this place, today, we are blessed with Indigenous women leaders who were all esteemed trailblazers before agreeing to be named to this chamber. Senators Michelle Odette, Mary Jane McCallum, Yvonne Boyer, Margot Greenwood, Judy White. I think of Inuit leader Rosemarie Kuptana, artist Daphne Ojig, Manitoba's own Jackie Travers, and my family's beloved friend, the legendary filmmaker Alanis Obomsawin, now 93 and working on her 54th film. Indigenous women and girls play a key role in preserving their communities. They often act as agents of peace, leading movements that eventually bring warring parties to the negotiation table. These strong, clear Indigenous women leaders are often the first to speak truth to power, including within their own communities, to address the root causes of conflict and increase community engagement. When I go home to Manitoba, I am honored to receive guidance from three of Winnipeg's most effective leaders, Hilda Anderson-Pearce, Sandra de la Ronde, and Diane Redsky, to discuss international advocacy in multilateral processes. Last year, they led the largest delegation of Indigenous women ever to arrive in Geneva to participate in the review of Canada under CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Before coming to this chamber, I was a professor who, with a team of students in our human rights program at the University of Winnipeg's Global College, ensured that Canada's first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security noted the importance of domestic peace building and Indigenous women's leadership. International studies have conclusively shown that women's participation in peace agreements leads to better and more sustainable outcomes with higher rates of implementation. Honoring this historic and heroic peace builder, Thanadelthur, through the passage of this bill, also honors Indigenous women as leaders. As a lesson in progress, I'm pleased to note that Canada's third National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security sets out efforts aimed at addressing gender-based discrimination, violence, oppression, and marginalization faced by women and gender-diverse people in Canada, particularly Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people, and acknowledges the intersecting discrimination and violence based on gender, Indigenous identity, socioeconomic status, and other identity factors. The second lesson I draw from her story is more somber, because Thanadelthur is also a symbol of unknown, effaced, and obscured Indigenous voices, stories sadly forgotten or deliberately erased, if not for the oral traditions that keep their lights burning. Remembering Thanadelthur speaks to our ongoing tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Research shows Indigenous women are 400% more likely than other Canadians to go missing. The problem is so pervasive that the Canadian government does not know how many Indigenous women are missing or have been murdered. Ironically, these are the women who are over-policed, underprotected. Estimates suggest that around 4,000 Indigenous women have been lost. Thanadelthur's own grave has been lost. The land of the original Fort York has eroded and washed out to sea. Without a monument to mark her resting place, a beautiful tradition has developed in northern Manitoba. In Churchill, there is a square in the town that says Thanadelthur's Square. And in northern Manitoba, to mark the date of her passing, people lay red roses into the waters of the Hudson Bay. Senator McCallum, in speaking to her bill, brought another modern dimension to this historic tale as she shared aspects of her own Cree upbringing in Manitoba and the ongoing joining of Cree and Dene communities across boundary lines. History is a living, growing thing. When history is herstory, Wisdom transcends time. To conclude, Thanadelthur's contributions provide a powerful example of the importance of commemorating Indigenous histories, as called for in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Call to Action 79, which calls for the federal government to, quote, develop a reconciliation framework for Canadian heritage and commemoration, and it continues to commemorate the contributions of Aboriginal peoples to Canada's history. Moving this bill to committee moves Canada a step toward actualizing our commitments under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and our domestic law adopting that declaration. I commend Senator McCallum for introducing us to Thanadelthur and to the act to establish National Thanadelthur Day. My last point is to remind us of Senator McCallum's bill to create a National Ribbon Day. There was some difficulty at the beginning of getting senators to speak to that bill. It did pass, and now across this nation, on National Ribbon Skirt Day, there are celebrations of little girls, whole generations, in longhouses, in community centers, in legislatures, celebrating National Ribbon Day. And it is the acute sense of her community, the taking of the pulse of people in Canada, that brings an acute sense and skill that we see in Senator McCallum's bills. This is yet another one, and this gives us a tremendous opportunity to be part of celebrating and respecting Indigenous leadership in this country. I hope we are ready to call the question. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
Senator Osler, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, please, sir.
Senator McPhedran, would you take a question?
With pleasure.
Senator Osler.
Thank you, Senator McPhedran. I note that March 8th is International Women's Day, and the theme this year is Gain to Give, emphasizing generosity, collaboration, and collective progress to advancing gender equality. How would National Thanadelthur Day contribute to advancing gender equality and reconciliation?
Senator McPhedran.
Thank you very much for the question, Senator Osler. I think more than anything, International Women's Day becomes a day when communities come together and focus on the contributions of women to their communities, to countries, to the world. And having a young heroine of 300 years ago to finally be recognized as a peace builder, as a negotiator, as a trilingual diplomat, essentially, would be a very tremendous addition to how Canadians could be thinking about International Women's Day and celebrating women's contributions.